On today's episode of the Innovative Schools podcast, we are talking with Professor John Almarode about student engagement, entertainment versus engagement, and how to hook your students into that wonderful lesson you work all night on. Come on, let's learn together. Hey, everybody, I am Jordan, your host for this episode of the Innovative Schools podcast. Today, we are talking with James Madison University professor John Almarode. John, welcome to the podcast.
Hey, thanks for having me. It's great to be here. I'm looking forward to this conversation.
Yeah, I am too. I was really excited when we were planning out the podcast for this season and we said, we need to get John on this podcast and talk to him about all of the different work and different things that you do. I'm a little upset because I know you best with a bow tie, but there's no bow tie today. You went with the blazer over the hoodie, but you're repping JMU.
I am, and this is my let's sit down and have a conversation about tough issues outfit versus the let me look so professional that if you come up behind me and scare me, I'll break. So it's a little bit of a different approach.
Got it. Okay, well, we'll run with it. If you look up John Almarode online, if you just type his name in, you will see the bow ties I'm referring to. Do you wear the same bow tie twice, or is it always a new one?
So I'm embarrassed to share that I have it set up so that I don't repeat in an academic year.
Okay.
My students will call me out. And so some of that is out of necessity because they'll say, you've already worn that one before. But let me be very clear.
Is there like a bow tie bingo that your students...
Yeah. So I think probably internally, is there one formally? I don't know that. But just to be clear so that it doesn't come across as gluttonous. Remember, I teach at a university, so I do not see them every day from August till May. And so I do not have 186 bow ties. No, not even half of that, not even a third, because I see them once or twice a week. So yes, I got it. Different bow tie every class.
Gotcha. So speaking about you teaching at JMU, what's your role there? What do you do for James Madison University?
So I'm in the College of Education, which means all of my students are future classroom teachers. Now, there are other programs in the college that are not pre-K through 12 destined individuals, but the program and the department that I work in, all of ours are going to be classroom teachers, and I teach methods courses. And so it's that transition from theory to practice and how to implement it in the context of a pre-K-12 classroom.
Got it. Yeah, that's super relevant stuff to our audience. So I'm glad that they get a little piece of kind of what you teach and what you do. There's two other things I want to bring up about you personally. Is I was looking at your website and reading through your biography and what you have written there, and you have a very special teacher to you that kind of sets you on this path. Can you talk a little bit about Miss Cross?
Absolutely. I'm always happy to talk about Miss Cross. I've always wanted to be a teacher. I grew up in a family of teachers, aunts, uncles, cousins. And so being a teacher was always something I wanted to do. Now I'm more comfortable sharing this. I was much more embarrassed by it when I was younger. I used to play school all the time. Whatever I learned that day at school, I would come home and teach it to myself, which is probably why I retained it, i.e. the science of learning. It wasn't until I walked through the threshold of room 30 at Stewart's Draft Middle School and met Miss Cross that I really locked in that I wanted to teach science, and I wanted to teach science a certain way.
Yeah.
And a lot of what we talk about today is going to tie back to the way that Miss Cross set up her classroom and the experiences I had in that classroom. It's driven a lot of my research. It's driven a lot of my decisions in the classroom. But more importantly, what's cool is that if you were, and there's no way this means anything, but as a point of reference, if you go 0.2 of a mile that way, you will be on Miss Cross's doorstep. And my children affectionately refer to her as Grandma Sally.
Oh, that's awesome. So she continues to be someone in your life. It sounds like a really special teacher, educator for you. Yeah.
Absolutely.
That's wonderful. So you mentioned a little bit about your research and things, and you've done work with John Hattie's visible learning. Can you tell us a little bit about what you've done with that just kind of just maybe a 50,000 foot view or whatever of your work with John Hattie's visible learning.
Sure. The way I met John Hattie is a bit of a twisted story.
Hmm.
I was handed his original visible learning book. It was no pictures, no color photos at all. It was nothing but a book about 800 meta-analyses on how students learn and achieve. And I
Uh-huh.
thought, God, what a boring book. So I gave it away. And then someone gave me another copy, and I gave that one away. And it wasn't until I had the third copy in my hands that I said, something's up here. Why is this the third time this one has been handed to me? So I read it, and I was like, wait a second, this is really important stuff. Somebody has actually brought all the research together. So jump ahead. I had the opportunity to interact with him and get to talk with him and share some ideas, and found myself then collaborating with him. So my role primarily now with John is to help with the translation of meta-analyses and the influences into classroom practice. And so
Gotcha.
while I help gather the metas and help analyze the metas and help maintain the visible learning database, my primary function is to work alongside him and his team to say, okay, so what would this look like in a middle school in Texas or Nebraska, and start that
Yeah.
translational work.
So let's get into engagement and talking about engagement. That's what we're really, really here for. So just at first, I feel like sometimes engagement is this buzzword kind of thing. You hear you have to engage your kids or your students, and engagement is important. And there's a lot of things about engagement. I guess to just start this conversation is, how do you define engagement, or how do you feel about it being a buzzword? Just what's kind of like your overall starting view of engagement in the classroom?
Yeah, and I mean this. I don't mean this as criticism, but it has become a jargon term, or it's
Mhm.
very jargony. And I think some of it is our desire to oversimplify things to try to get an impact. So we've
Sure,
taken
yeah.
engagement and we said, all right, it's this term, we overuse it, and it's become this mysterious thing. So all right, let's simplify it down. So the only way to do that is to say students are engaged or they aren't engaged. The minute we turned it into a dichotomy, a yes or no situation, that's where it starts to get really, really tough, and it becomes an even more jargony type word.
Mhm.
Uh, so there are three things I would say about the word engagement. Number one, we've oversimplified it to a yes or no situation. Number two, we tend to view engagement through our own experiences and the lenses that we have in front of us,
Hmm.
failing to recognize, and again, this is not critical and there's no malintent here, but failing to recognize that I may engage with something differently than you might, or this person might engage. And so we tend to view engagement through our lens. And the third piece is that we try to then, through the oversimplification and then looking at it through our lens, we then try to generalize it and try to explain it in ways that actually take us farther away from something that might help us truly up the engagement in, say, 7th grade social studies or 12th grade literature or 5th grade language arts and mathematics. And so that has led to some recent research to try to make sense of engagement. What does it mean to be engaged? And if you're listening to this podcast, I would ask you to say, all right, what does it mean to be engaged in your classroom?
Yeah.
And that's how I define it. What does it mean to be a good learner in your context? What would a learner say or do, or how would they feel if they were truly making progress and growth in your learning environment? And that does several things. Number one, it recognizes that context matters. If I'm in EMT class in a career technical course, that engagement is going to look different than if I'm analyzing Beowulf. And it's going to look different if I'm learning about overhand throwing in physical education. And it's going to look different than if I'm understanding the elements of a thesis statement and how to write a narrative in 6th grade language arts. So engagement to me means, what is the student actively doing? How are they actively interacting with the environment to make progress in their growth and their learning. And the reason I ask that of the listeners is it's going to differ based on that context, and recognizing that is the first step to getting out of the jargon and into the action.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point that you make of how your context really changes your perception of engagement or what engagement should look like you were saying, is that engagement looks different between PE or physical education, where you're learning how to throw versus how to write a paper. um, and really, think I'm even just sitting here now as we're recording this, and I'm thinking, okay, what am I expecting of myself being engaged in this conversation? Like, answering that question, because I think you can't really expect a student to engage if you don't know what that looks like,
Yeah.
right? You're kind of asking them to just hunt in the dark to figure out what it means to engage. Um, One of the other, jumping back to kind of at the beginning, you're saying that engagement is a yes, or we've looked at it as a yes or no. So I'm reading into that, thinking that maybe there's other levels to engagement from your perspective, what you're saying.
Absolutely. So what we've done, and when I say we, it's the royal we. While I've done some of the research around engagement, there are
Sure.
many
Yeah.
others that study it. So when I say we,
Yeah.
understand it is the royal we. Um, what's interesting is that if you're listening to this podcast, you are likely going to have different levels of engagement. Here, if you're driving home from work and listening to this podcast, your engagement's going to be fundamentally different than if you're sitting at your kitchen table listening to it and have the opportunity to pause and answer the question that I posed
Mm.
earlier. What does it mean to be a good learner? So you might pause it and actually write that out. You might discuss this with a neighbor. You might talk to yourself in the car, but if you're driving your vehicle, you are limited. So there are even different levels of engagement, but it doesn't mean the person in the car listening to this podcast is somehow less engaged or not as interested and motivated as the person sitting at their kitchen table or talking it out with a colleague. It's just a different level. And what's fascinating is if you pull together what engagement looks like across different contexts: physical education, 12th grade literature, 5th grade mathematics, 7th grade ag science, there are some commonalities. And that's allowed us to do is to lay them out on the table and say, okay, can we think about engagement not as a yes or no? Because that's not healthy and it's not
Mhm.
helpful, because you may have a learner sitting in the desk. And if you're listening, I need you to either amen this or nod your head at this one. If
Mhm.
you have a learner that's sitting in your classroom staring out the window, your first assumption is little Leroy's not paying attention. But
Mhm.
what if little Leroy is playing out in his head how the water cycle actually works, and they just needed to break eye contact with
Sure.
the
Yeah.
board and kind of think through it, and they're actually visualizing in their mind what the water cycle it looks like, feels like, and sounds like. We've made assumptions on Leroy's body, and by the way, Leroy, because where I come from, that's what we name our kids. Um, we make some assumptions. So yes or no doesn't work. There's got to be more
Yeah.
to it, and so there's a continuum of engagement. While it was first made famous by Amy Berry, a researcher out of Australia, it's become the prevailing view of engagement, going from what I would say would be active disengagement, where the learner is tearing that room up. They are actively disrupting, to passive disengagement, where they are staring off into space, thinking about the weekend. If you're in a faculty meeting, and this is going to really resonate with some of your listeners, you're in a faculty meeting and you're looking to the front of the room, but you're doing email.
Mhm.
That's passive disengagement. You're not
That's what I'm doing right now in this podcast. No, I'm not.
yeah. Uh, and my pauses are because, I'm reading text messages. We
Yeah.
all do it. But there's that passive. You're not actively disrupting anything. You're behaving, but your mind's somewhere else. To then passive engagement, where I'm just following directions, I'm doing what you tell me, but nothing more. All the way then to active engagement, where, here we go, where we bring together all of the answers to what makes a good learner, and we find commonalities. And so learners are setting goals, they're asking questions, they're seeking feedback, they're giving themselves feedback, they're monitoring their progress, they're evaluating their current level of understanding. So there are all of these commonalities that come out of the answers to those questions that have become known as active engagement. But we can slide up and down that continuum on a daily
Mhm.
basis for lots of reasons. There are lots of reasons why I might not be actively engaged now, but then come back to it. So it's a continuum, in my opinion, that is the best way to think about it,
Yeah.
as a continuum.
Yeah. Yeah, that's great. We did some research just trying to figure out, see kinda to bring some clarity to engagement, like what's actually happening. Are kids engaged? Are they not engaged? How, like, whatever things. And so we did find in 2018, I guess there was a study done. This says it was 5 million students. 47% of the students surveyed said that they said they were engaged. But then, like you're talking about that continuum, 29% said that they were not engaged, and 24 were actively disengaged. And I think that's a great clarity to bring to this whole idea of engagement, because I even think with my daughter, she's 7 right now, as I can be trying to help her with her homework and telling her something or talking to her, and she looks like she's on another planet,
Uh-huh.
just taking in the views of whatever's there. And I'll say, "Are you listening to what I'm saying?" And she can tell me every single thing that I said, like, and how to do it, and then she can, like, get into her work. But I make that assumption about, her looking, participating, so to speak. Her lack of participating, or what I'm interpreting as participating, is her not engaged in what I'm saying. So, with that, like, talking about I wanna talk a little bit about kind of getting into that conversation of engagement versus participation. You said it a little bit, but just kinda helping the listeners maybe identify or look at, how do we actually identify engagement versus some other things that, like you were saying, they're staring out the window and they're just processing it and playing it in their head versus not actually engaged.
Yeah. And that is a huge challenge unless you have an fMRI, or a PET scan,
Sure.
or a Meg machine in your classroom. What we're trying to capture is what's happening inside the learner's cognitive architecture
Mhm.
in room 30, sixth grade science classroom. And so that creates a bit of a challenge because it means we rely on other cues and clues to tell us what's happening.
Mhm.
And so your daughter, that's a great example. If I rely too much on behavioral cues without gathering evidence,
Mm.
I'm going to make some assumptions that may lead to mistakes that actually disengage a learner that was engaged because we fuss at them. I need you to pay attention. Look up here. Quit
Right,
staring out the
yeah.
window. So then what we do is we mess with their emotional feelings about the classroom. And so then they check out because now they are like, wait a second, I'm not safe. I just got yelled at. So you have just captured exactly what makes this so hard. The old model of engagement, in addition to yes and no, was there's cognitive, there's behavioral, and there's emotional. And while that does explain the three levels of engagement, what it forgets to do is explain how they're integrated, and it ignores the fact we really can't capture some of that. And so what you're talking about here with your daughter, and my daughter experiences the same thing. My son is much better about that because he's a 10-year-old. Tessa is 13. And so as a teenager, she's not going to show her hand. But the
Yeah.
10-year-old, he'll tell you. He'll just come out and say, because he's at that age. And so how do we capture this? The answer I have right now, and that doesn't mean it's going to be the answer I have later, is the University of Oklahoma at Norman, their K-20 Center did a lit review that is just phenomenal. And they identified a term known as agentic engagement. And so what it does is it focuses on specific behaviors of the learner, but requires the teacher to make those behaviors visible.
Mm.
Let me tell you what I mean. Agentic engagement is what we've talked about: asking questions, seeking feedback, engaging in self-evaluation, metacognitive strategy, all those sorts of things. But it does require, as a classroom teacher, for me to create experiences that make that thinking and learning visible. So I have to then make sure that I have students say, turn to your neighbor and summarize what you've just heard. And then I'm listening. Write out this summary. Hey, take a quick second and answer this question based on what you've just read. Show me your active reading strategy. In other words, how do we make thinking and learning visible so that we can bring what's inside their brains out into the open?
Yeah.
Contrast that with a student who sits in the classroom, watches a PowerPoint presentation, and does fill in notes for 45 minutes. You have no idea what they're thinking
Yeah,
about, and you
nothing.
have no opportunity to let you know.
Yeah. So you have to have so as teachers and educators, we have to have a way to really put facts, I guess, on paper for us to like look at things because you can't tell with the exterior, the way body language or anything, always if they're engaged or participating or any of that different stuff. So,
Absolutely.
it sounds like what you're saying, and I agree with that. I've seen that in my own life that's really important to verify the information that's being soaked in. Well, we are going to take a little break.
Okay.
And when we come back from that break, we'll continue this conversation. We'll get more into this entertainment versus um, engagement kind of question, and hopefully a couple additional things because we've already given some of things that teachers can do to try and help with engagement in their students and everything. So everyone, hang out for a little bit, and we'll see you guys after the break. Are you ready to level up your education game? Join us at the Innovative Schools Summit, the nation's top K-12 education conference. Connect with internationally recognized thought leaders, educators, and consultants as we dive into game-changing teaching strategies and research-based methods. Each summit features multiple conferences all in one location, covering topics like at-risk students, innovative teaching strategies, school discipline, and so much more. Create your own learning experience by choosing any of the sessions from any of the conferences. With events in cities like New York, Orlando, Las Vegas, Nashville, and San Antonio, there's always a summit near you. The next Innovative School Summit is in Orlando, March 20th through 23rd, 2025. If you can't make it to Orlando, why don't you check out one of our summer summits in Las Vegas or Nashville at innovativeschoolssummit.com. See you there. Learn from the best in education and earn professional development contact hours through AccuEd.com. AccuEd.com is an online learning platform with over 35 masterclass style courses giving you more than 75 hours of training on classroom management, leadership, innovative teaching strategies, and student engagement from K-12 thought leaders such as Pedro Noguera, Michelle Borba, Baruti Kafele, Barbara Colaroso, and Michael Bonner. As a special promotion with the Innovative Schools podcast, you can get 10% off your first 6 months of AccuEd when you use promo code PODCAST. Visit AccuEd.com and start learning from the best experts in education today. Hey, welcome back, everybody, to the Innovative Schools podcast. We've been talking with Dr. John Almarode from James Madison University about engagement. He's already given us some great things to think about, like what does it look like in your classroom when engagement happens? Answering that kind of question, taking some time to reflect on that, and seeing because the context matters, whether you're in an English class or a math class or physical education or art. Engagement can look different in all of that. And we've also already kind of talked about how um, you can't rely on the outside appearance of a student necessarily to know if they're engaged. We kind of talked about maybe that kid that looks like they are 50 miles away looking out the window, can maybe they're just processing what was just said and they're actually still completely engaged and they're working through that. Um, but so John's still with us. Uh, I wanted to get into this question though with engagement. Engagement versus entertainment. Are they the same thing? Are they different? Pros, cons. Let's just talk about these two words: entertainment versus engagement.
Whew, that's a tough one. And boy, I wrestle with this one a lot because some of it is our desire to keep up with our learners. And we're
Mm.
almost forced into this, right? I mean, one of the buzz sayings or the cliches that I use all the time is how do we get them to eat peas when all they want to do is eat ice cream?
Yes, I love that saying.
And the idea being is how am I supposed to get learners in my own classroom when I taught high school math? How am I supposed to get learners to engage in trig identities when I'm competing with Fortnite,
Yeah,
Minecraft, Roblox, block? I'm not sure if I'm allowed to name official things on a podcast, but you get where I'm going with this.
here we are.
Yeah, here we are.
Yeah.
The environments they have on their phones and their televisions, and I'm
Yeah.
supposed to get them to be on fire for trig identities? Are you kidding me? And so then what do? I choose to then entertain and
Mhm.
hope that it leads to them being able to use trig identities to solve express. So first of all, education, entertainment, and educational engagement are two very different things.
Yeah.
Um, the old slogan, you can bring a horse to water, but you can't make them drink, it applies here. So there's nothing wrong with engaging learners with a hook, something that grabs
Mhm.
their attention. In science, it might be a demonstration. In language arts, it might be a provocative question. In social studies, it might be a scenario where individuals are personally attached. Uh, Civil rights related.
Yeah.
In physical education, it might be a game. There's a difference between hooking them and then using that hook then to build in the necessary skills, concepts, and understandings. They are very different.
Sure.
Does entertainment work? Well, here's the deal. How many times have you watched a great movie, you've read a great book, but then when you went to tell someone about it, you struggled to give the details. You had to speak in generalities,
Yeah, yeah,
or
that's a great example.
you even said, "Well, I can't think of it right now, but go
Yeah,
watch
yeah,
it.
yeah,
You'll
yeah.
love it." Well, you can't if you entertain on it in science, they can't get to the test and go, "Well, I can't think of it right now, but you should go take the class. You'll figure it out." No, it doesn't work. So
Yeah.
we have evidence that entertainment only lasts so long. One more example of how we know this: you hear a great joke, it makes you laugh. I mean, you belly laugh at it. You go to tell it to someone else, you're almost guaranteed to screw up the punchline. Why? Because it
Mm.
entertains you, but you didn't retain the information in that joke. So they are different. They
Yeah.
are
Yeah,
very
yeah,
different.
yeah. Yeah, I think so. I love movies, and so you using that as an example. My wife and I actually when the Best Picture nominations come out every year, we try and watch all of them. It's just a thing that we do. We've done it our whole marriage. We try and watch them all, and I can think back to some of my favorite movies and how they engage me to go and talk about them. But I can talk about them in specifics, or even it makes me want to go and look up online what other people have said or look more deeply into the subject or whatever's going on opposed to a movie that I'm like, "Oh, that's fun." Maybe thinking like I love Marvel movies
Huh?
and sometimes maybe one of them I don't know that much about the specific hero in that movie, but I'll go and look at it. But most of the time I'm like, "Yeah, it was a fun movie. It had explosions and they saved people, I guess." Yeah, I guess it was fun. But watching, something that's a little bit more engaging of like, oh, I can really understand that person and then drawing me in to do more research and to look and seeing that difference between the entertainment and engagement. Um, so I've seen a trend, I don't know if trend's the right word, on social media about trying to engage students and would like your take on this of sometimes I see these teachers who are standing on desks or
Uh-huh.
they're making kind of elaborate. I think I saw one the other day of a teacher who turned their classroom into an airplane so
Okay.
that their kids could be like on the airplane to go and learn about another country. Like they took the airplane, like, they had, like, sit and, like, the whole room was covered, and just to make it look like the inside of an airplane, they had tickets and things that they had to do, and then they had a layover, and also so, I don't know. I guess, my question is thinking about engagement versus entertainment, a little bit more of where's that line? Did these things work to do these big elaborate things, or is it maybe sometimes they work, maybe they don't? I don't know. What's your take on stuff like that?
So probably the most disappointing answer you could ever expect on a podcast. I have no idea. But
Hmm.
here's what I mean. Here's what I mean by that. There's a reason I'm pretty confident to say I don't know.
Yeah.
If they come into the room and they have their tickets and they sit on the airplane and they travel to Cairo or Alexandria, um, that might have a huge impact on their learning, Or it might just be they get so wrapped up in the airplane and so, pretending that they're traveling that they no longer listen. So the trend is, and the
Mm,
connection here is, it depends on what happens next.
got
It
it.
depends on what strategies, approaches, interventions, techniques that the teacher uses following the airplane ride that determines whether information is acquired, consolidated, and stored. The airplane is the attention getter, but what I do when I have their attention matters most. Otherwise, it's nothing but smoke and mirrors. So
Gotcha.
the reason I don't know is because in that classroom, I would want to know, what did you do next once you had them on the airplane and they were ready to
Mm,
go? What did you do next when you stood on the desk? What did you do
yeah.
next when you taught them the song? It's not the song, the desk, or the airplane. It's what happens next that determines whether that makes a difference or whether you're just a carnival act for a room
Yeah.
full of 6-year-olds.
Yeah, I think, that's a really great distinction, to think it could be helpful.
Mhm.
But like you're saying, the more important part is what you do once you have their attention. I can make a loud noise and get the attention of a room, but what I say after that is more important than me just yelling to get attention. So let's talk a little bit about that next step then. Um, you said a little bit in the first part of the podcast about how you have to kind of collect data from your students
Mm.
to know if they are engaged. You can't look at their facial expression or kind of what's going on, but you have to collect that data. What's a good way or some good ways for educators to collect that data? And then the next question will be, what do we do with that after it's collected?
So the next steps, there are some general guidelines, principles that the science of learning gives us that helps make decisions post airplane, post getting on the desk, um, post teaching the dance. Okay, so
Hmm.
here's number one. What are the students actively processing? So general principle number one is, students must be actively processing the content, the skills, and the understanding. In other words, we shift the lift. Who's doing the heavy lifting? If I'm doing all of the talk about Alexandria and ancient Egypt when they get
Yeah,
off the airplane, then they are passively engaged on that continuum.
sure.
If
Yeah.
I am simply lecturing to them about the order of operations after I've gotten on the desk and acted it out, then they're just passively engaged. And the same thing goes then for the song or the dance. So, guideline number one is, are they doing the heavy lifting, or are you doing the heavy lifting? Am I doing the
Sure.
heavy lifting?
Yeah.
That's number one. Number two, in that heavy lifting, am I generating visible evidence of their thinking? It's the difference between a matching worksheet and a 3-minute writing task where they have to write a summary of what they learned. In the matching
Hmm.
task, I just know whether A was matched with 17 or 17 matched. With the writing task, I get to see what vocab they used, what
Hmm.
connections they made, how they sequenced their summaries. And so, am I giving them tasks that make their thinking visible that I then can see where they are?
Yeah. That sounds a lot like whenever I learn something new, my wife she might get a little annoyed with this, but I go home and I want to talk to her about it. And she's like, I don't care what you're talking about. It's like, I don't care if you care. I want to see if I can explain it.
Yeah,
I
that's
want to
it.
see if I've gotten this well. And if I can explain it to you, then I feel like I've actually learned whatever the concept is. It sounds a lot like that kind of concept.
Absolutely. Richard Mayer is a professor. I think he might be professor emeritus now at a UC Santa Barbara, and he coined the term generative learning. Generative learning and generative learning strategies are those strategies that actively ask learners to select, organize, and integrate
Mm,
content. And so there are a specific group of strategies that are known for having higher levels of impact on student learning, but it's because they are doing the active processing, they are actively engaged, and it makes the learning visible so the teacher can see it. jump ahead to visible learning, one of the things we've noticed in the visible learning database is if you go to the section in the database on learning strategies and teaching strategies and you pull those down, those that are the highest effect size strategies, in other words, those are the strategies that have the highest potential to move student learning forward, they all have one thing in common. And that thing in common is the exact opposite of those strategies that have a lower effect size. For example, lectures versus classroom discussion. What's the difference? In the high effect size strategies, they all require the learner to select, organize, and integrate and make their thinking visible. Versus a lecture, you don't have to do anything, which is why a lecture has an effect size of negative 0.35. It's awful. Lecture never works. Never works. No matter how you try to defend it, no matter how you advocate for lecture, there's no shred of evidence that says it works. So that leads actually to that third guideline. What do I do when I do this? Give feedback and have the learners give themselves feedback based on their summary, based on the classroom discussion. And so the data seems to point strongly to this idea that on that continuum, to bring it back to the very start of our conversation, take it all the way back, active engagement is correlated with higher learning outcomes because of the science of learning and the things that our cognitive architecture needs to acquire, consolidate, and store that learning.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense, and I see that in the way that I am in, like, even researching to talk to you. I found myself reading your bio and looking at some of your books, and then I was selecting the information, trying to store it and talk to somebody else about it, or write it into a script or something like that, and then having someone else check and be like, "Does this make sense to you? Does this work?" And it sounds like, or not sounds like this is what you're saying is teachers need to make sure that they're not doing all the lifting. When you're doing a lecture, you're doing all lifting. You're just
Yeah.
spouting off facts or whatever.
Yeah.
And you could have worked all night on that lecture and you're like, I have crafted these words perfectly and I'm going to present them well. All, everything like that. But its effect size is small. And I even think to myself, I think probably back to the subjects I had the hardest time was teachers who just kind of got up there and spoke. And I was actively disengaged. And today there's so many more ways to be actively disengaged than when I was in school. I
Yep.
mean, we had daydreaming. Now there's phones and social media and all this different stuff. Whatever concert tickets just dropped and I need to get those. There's so many different ways to be actively disengaged that you said this earlier that there's more going into, and I think that's where educators can fall into that trap of trying to just be entertaining and not truly engaged, or being well, the teachers are engaged, but getting the students engaged,
Right.
they're just trying to put on a show. So I think this is super important information and things for educators to consider.
And I'm guilty as charged, right? I mean,
Yeah.
because I spend my days with 20-year-olds who
Yeah.
are in sororities, fraternities, service groups. They're trying to pad their resume. Some of them are working 2 jobs to be able to pay for college. Some of them are taking care of parents. Some of them have
Yeah.
siblings. And here I am teaching a methods course. And so there are days I have to resist edutainment,
Mhm.
but then I have to have a reasonable alternative, because if I ask a 20-year-old to choose between a lecture, which, by the way, I do not lecture, if I ask them to choose between a lecture and an event on Friday night with their sorority or fraternity,
Mhm.
I know what they'll pick. I'd have picked the same
You're
thing.
you're losing every time.
Yeah, so guilty as charged. And you said something that I do not want to leave. And I think as we wind down, we got to grab that. You said that even if the professor spent all night crafting their words, and writing a beautiful lecture, the professor did all the active engagement, which means the professor is
Sure.
going to know the lecture. The student
Mhm.
had no active engagement at all, and so and they do not care about pointillism in modern art history the way you do. And so
Yeah.
I'm telling you, this active level of processing, I think, is going to be incredibly beneficial to our understanding of engagement for years to come. And I'm grateful that researchers that we have moved in this direction away from a dichotomous approach or well, that's emotional, that's cognitive behavior, to a more comprehensive, contextual based understanding, and putting the entertainment part where it belongs, the hook
Yeah.
or the consolidation, but not the main course.
Yeah. No, that's great. So, I would put this challenge out to our listeners is for them to take what they've heard here, organize it, select, organize, and
Yeah.
go talk to somebody about what you learned here to help you kind of ingest that a little bit more for you to make sure that you understand it. And then even check back, listen to the podcast again. I'm not just saying this for views and downloads, but to validate that you absorb the information. Really, really challenge yourself to um, reflect on your own engagement with this podcast or whatever it is that you're learning and what's going on to hopefully help you analyze and understand your students better. Um, John, I thank you so much for joining us. I want to just talk about a couple of things that you have. So you have a lot of books um, that you've published or that you've authored and co-authored and all this different stuff. There's a couple that I want to talk about. One is Teacher Clarity, which should be out by now, right? When this podcast goes out,
Correct.
that talks somewhat about engagement and what we've talked about here, maybe a little bit more in depth. You have two others: How Learning Works Playbook and How Feedback Works Playbook, which play into this too of being able to get feedback from your students to know if they're engaged.
Yeah.
So I want to encourage our listeners to check those books out. We'll put links in the show notes. If someone wanted to connect with you, John, what's the best place to do that?
So they can connect with me on X at JT Almarode. I'm on Facebook,
Mm,
but you can also check out, this is just for lack of a creative name, johnalmarode.com. There's a way to click on a button
yeah.
and that email comes directly to me. I'm happy to answer questions, keep the conversation going, take feedback. Maybe you weren't engaged during this podcast and you need to let me know that
Yeah.
podcast on
Sure.
engagement was boring as all get out. We can go there too. So yeah, reach out anyway.
Yeah.
I'm happy to keep the conversation going.
That's great. Yeah. So make sure you check out John and the work that he's done to help you in your classroom. If you've enjoyed today's episode, please rate, review, and share this with anyone in your life that would benefit from engagement or one of our other episodes. We want to help as many educators as possible be the best versions of themselves as possible, and that happens through sharing and reviewing things like that. Education is one of the hardest jobs in the world, but it's also one of the most rewarding. And we here at the Innovative Schools podcast want to empower all educators to be their best. We hope you learned something today that you can use in your classroom later today, maybe later this week, or whenever the next time you find yourself teaching. So thank you for joining us. Thank you, John, for helping us explain engagement, and we will see you guys on the next episode.